So I'm just going to say a few words. My name is Billy Wimsatt. I'm the proud executive director of Movement Voter Project. And we're less than 6 months out from Election Day, November 3rd. That fateful day that will forever decide the course of human history and civilization on planet Earth. That's right. And of course, we know elections don't happen on one day anymore. So we're actually only less than 5 months out.
4 points ahead.
That's not good enough.
I think there's some people that might need to be muted.
It's good.
People, we are less than 5 months out from the start of early vote, less than 5 months out from the absentee ballot request deadlines, from voter reg deadlines. And as we know with the pandemic, we have to do everything extra early now. In many ways, get out the vote has already begun for the 2020 election, making changes to election administration at the state and county level, driving online voter registration, IDs, absentee ballot requests. We got to get these things in early to make sure they're right and to help people with that. And we got to get ahead of the curve. Are students going to be voting from dorms this fall or from home? Our local partners, excuse me, our heroes in the battleground states doing this good work to decide the fate of all of our futures are preparing for every scenario. And we have to make sure they have the resources to do that, just like we have to have the doctors and nurses have the resources. So welcome everyone to Win the Midwest Part 2. This is the second in our 2-part series. Last month, we focused on Wisconsin right after the election. It was an incredible, moving call. If you haven't heard it, I highly suggest listening to it. This month, we're going to talk about the Midwest strategy as a whole. It is imperative that we win the Midwest. And it's not that we love the Midwest more than any other region, although some of us are a little biased, being from there. But we care about the Midwest for the same reason that we care about the South and Southwest. These are neglected swing state regions that will determine the fate of our country. And me right here in Massachusetts, my fate will be determined by the people on this call and how much they get supported. So I'm asking you, please, we have to care about all the critical states, the entire presidential election, and the fate of the entire world. It's unreal, could come down to a few thousand votes in one of these states that we're talking about today. And the gap is huge. We're currently estimating there's a $300 to $400 million gap on the independent side for C3s, C4s, 527s, working in these Tier 1 and Tier 2 presidential Senate states. The Midwest alone, including Pennsylvania, represents probably 120 million of that gap. So we have to close that gap, and it has to happen very soon. In the next month or so, organizations have to make hires. They have to train staff. They need to do digital retrofitting. They need to run big, ambitious programs and experimental programs to support and motivate voters in this unprecedented time. And with Biden as the presumptive nominee, this is a major, major concern, getting people motivated to vote, right? So if you've gone big, thank you. And can we go bigger? If you've organized a house party, thank you. Can you organize another one? Can you organize 3? If you think this pandemic is bad, which it is the worst thing that most of us have ever experienced in our lives, see what happens with 4 more years of Trump, with the judicial appointments and climate impact alone. Okay, this is the rainy day we've been waiting for, people. This is the bat signal we've been waiting for. This is the movement moment we've been waiting for. There's no greater cause or moment than this one right now that we are in. And we need you, all of you. And we had over 250 people sign up for this call. Thank you so much for being here. And you don't have to do this alone. Get together with a friend, with someone on our team. We're here to do this as a team. Make a list. What more can you do? Who more can you reach out to? This is the fight of our lives, and the amazing, amazing leaders you're going to hear from today are at ground zero of this crisis and the solutions, both the pandemic and the election, and we need to support them any way humanly possible. So I just want to thank all our incredible team, the MVP team, our partners, donors, local organizers, the Chicago team, the Minnesota team, Jackie and Rebecca, and I'm going to pass it to Laura right now from our Minnesota team, and who's going to introduce the call and the speakers. So welcome.
Thanks, Billy. Hey guys, it is so great to be with you all. This is the second of our two-part series on winning the Midwest. As I think a lot of you know, we were going to have this big, great, amazing conference in Chicago last month. So this is both happy day to be here together online, but also a little sad because we weren't able to gather in person and really showcase all of the brilliant organizing that's going on across our region. But before we start, I just wanted to say a little bit about what the whole, like why did we want to have that conference and what we were focusing on. And to say that for us, this was never about, us here in the Midwest was never just about winning a couple of states in order to get rid of Trump, although that is enough. But we were trying to think about this historically. And we were trying to say that the states of our region have been voting together in tandem for the past 50 years. And this is this slide that's up right now. So these are the battleground states of the Midwest, moving from Minnesota, which is the bluest corner of this hinge that swings the country, all the way into Western Pennsylvania, which, yes, we know it's not technically in the Midwest, but because of demographics and voting patterns and really the issues at stake are really similar, we are including it in this region that we consider, that we see as a hinge that's been swinging the whole country for the past 50 years along with it. So when this region votes Republican, a Republican is president, and when it votes Democratic, a Democrat's in the White House. And we were trying to figure out how can we use especially the bluest parts of this region to swing the whole hinge. So our thinking was, and then the other piece of it, we were very inspired by our partners at Way to Win, who were putting forward an entire strategy focused on the South and Southwest of the country, predicated on the idea that huge demographic change is happening in those states like Arizona and Georgia and Florida, and that if we can transform them with higher turnout among young people and people of color, we can transform our country. And I actually met Doran originally at the first Way to Win conference 3 years ago, and we were sort of like sitting there thinking like, well, actually that's happening in our states too. And we were so frustrated by the story that had been told over and over since 2016 about our region, which the story was mostly told from the coast, and it centered white working class voters, but really when they said white working class voters, they almost always meant men, and angry and out of work, and part of this whole Rust Belt story. And we felt that there was actually a whole other story. It didn't match the story we were seeing on the ground. And that story, which became so prominent after 2016, really erased the movement that we were seeing, which is this whole new generation of folks being elected. So Rashida Tlaib in Michigan, Ilhan Omar here in my district in the 5th of Minnesota, Mitra Jalali, who's elected to city council in St. Paul, Mandela Barnes, the new lieutenant governor in Wisconsin, and people like Andrea Jenkins, the first trans woman elected to a city council in a major American city. And this is just a small sampling. We were seeing this happening all over the Midwest in our cities, and even sometimes in small towns, a new young electorate emerging who were then electing people who looked like them and who represented them. And we wanted to really tell that story and highlight what we know is an emerging multiracial electorate across the Midwest. So we wanted to make the case that we can win the Midwest, not just by shaving off a few swing voters, but actually by mobilizing this coalition. So since then, and now let's go back to the agenda slide, because I'm gonna go back to Alex to the agenda slide. So since then, obviously the world has changed. We're in a pandemic, we're in a complete economic meltdown. And so everything has changed, but in some ways nothing has changed. The story that Trump is gonna tell is the same story. They're gonna double down on racism, Islamophobia, and anti-immigrant sentiment in order to try to win our region. And we have to fight in the same way we were planning to fight. Only now we have to change our tactics and our messaging. So we wanted to focus both on that long-term story and the way the strategists across our region are pivoting in this moment. So we're going to start with Doran Schrantz, who's the ED of Faith in Minnesota, leading a huge multiracial coalition here in Minnesota. to give us an overview of Midwestern terrain and kind of how we got here and why we've been so susceptible to Trumpism here. And then we're going to move into the 3 imperatives that, as a group, these strategists have told us what we absolutely need to do in this moment, and that's to break through the isolation and fear of the COVID moment, to leverage the power of organizing and relationships. Doran's going to come back in and talk about that. So Art Reyes from We the People Michigan, who is leading an equally large, huge multiracial coalition in his state, is going to talk about breaking through isolation and connecting. And then Doran's going to talk about organizing our people online now, having to do it digitally, but the tactics that we can use. And then Prentiss, who is the leader of the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, is going to talk about how we make the narrative intervention and really change the story and break through the noise of this moment. And then we'll do some questions and answers, takeaways, and have time to hear a little bit from you all. So I'm going to turn it over to Doran to tell us how we got here.
Thank you, Laura and Billy. I am so excited to be here. I am also sorry that we're not meeting in person, but this is also exciting. So I'm really glad to be here, and thank you to everyone for being on this call. I am going to start by saying that I am absolutely a Midwest partisan. I was born and raised in the Midwest. I grew up in Iowa. I did a brief stint in Chicago, which I think counts as the Midwest. And I have been living and organizing and raising my family in Minnesota for the past 17 years. Just real quickly, Faith in Minnesota is a statewide community organizing organization. We organize childcare centers, churches, Islamic centers, small businesses, and are completely committed to building the agency, dignity, and capacity of people to lead and build a people-centered politics in Minnesota and beyond. And that's what I've been committed to building for 17 years. And part of the reason that I've been so committed to building Faith in Minnesota and building in the Midwest is because the history of how we got here is really a lived experience that I have. My most salient early political memories growing up in Southern Iowa was in the 1980s, were the meatpacking plant strikes, the farm foreclosure crisis, and the devastation that had on my town, from like boarded up windows to the entire downtown closing, to people losing their jobs, to those who could get out of town, trying to get out of town, and those who couldn't, being stuck. And my question for a long time has been, A, why did that happen? And B, what would it have taken to change that story? So a lot of what our organizing is about is how we chart a different course and create a new story that could change the ending of people, actually improve people's lives and make it so that regular people, working people, people of color, our people can chart the course of their future, which would look really different than what happened in my town growing up in the 1980s. So that's where I come from, and that's what I'm passionate about, and that's what brings me here. So the first thing I want to sort of address is, can we say that the Midwest is a region? So I'm going to ask you to move to the next slide. There we go. So Laura touched on this, but it's really compelling also to look at this particular picture. So since 1970, all the way through 2016, from Minnesota through Western Pennsylvania, have tracked in alignment with each other in terms of how they vote in presidential elections and beyond. And that has a lot to do with like similar experiences, similar economic patterns, similar demographic patterns, similar like political and cultural sets of experiences. But it is true, and it's helpful to imagine as we go into 2020 that this arena of the country actually is a region, and there are patterns both of how we actually do our work and how we do our politics, and how we can understand both what has happened and how we got here, and so that we can understand where we're going from here. So obviously the story about the Midwest goes back decades and decades and decades, but there has been a like a pivot point of focus, a spotlight and crosshairs of this region, starting with the results of the 2016 election. So the first thing I want to say about the results of the 2016 election that's important to remind ourselves of is that Donald Trump won on a 77,000 vote margin across a set of 3 states that gave him an electoral college victory. So that was not predetermined that that was going to happen. And it's not predetermined that he's going to win again in these states in 2020. 77,000 votes is a statistical error. Now, how did we get to the point that Donald Trump could win 77,000 votes? There's a lot of background that created the conditions in which that became possible. I don't know that it was necessarily probable. You'll have to ask Nate Silver about that, but it definitely was possible. So there has been a national obsession with trying to understand the nature of those 77,000 votes, and it's super contested. Like, is it because of white working class men? Is it maybe what we need is just like a pure economic populism argument? Maybe we need a moderate and centrist path. Or maybe we should write off the Midwest altogether and put all of our chips in Arizona and North Carolina. Now, I am absolutely for putting a lot of chips in North Carolina, Arizona, and Georgia. We have to do that. That is part of the future of our country. But writing off the Midwest politically is dangerous. It's dangerous for us, and it's danger for the future of progressive politics in the United States. So we don't think we have to write it off. We think we can win it. So, but to understand why we were vulnerable to 77,000 votes tipping the election to Donald Trump, we need to look a little bit at what has happened. And I'm going to do that through the lens of Minnesota because it's what I know the best, but it tracks similar stories could be told about other states. So instead of giving you a bunch of statistics, I'm going to show you a picture. So I'm going to have the next slide. This slide represents 2 iconic Time magazine covers that represent iconic Minnesotans, and it's about 35 years apart. So in the first picture, if anybody knows anything about the Midwest, you may have heard of Lake Wobegon. So the first picture is Governor Wendell Anderson. He was on the cover of Time magazine. It was called the Minnesota Miracle. And he looks exactly like a lot of white Minnesotans' mind's eye of what it means to be a Minnesotan. I'll just put it that way. The second picture is another iconic Minnesotan, Ilhan Omar, who is the first Somali refugee to be elected to Congress, and she is a Black Muslim woman. So the difference between the mind's eye of what it means to be a Minnesotan is pretty much captured by these 2 pictures. This is the change that has unfolded across our region and across our country. Okay, next slide. So the Midwestern states are changing demographically. I mean, so if we think about the bets on the new American majority, the rising American electorate, the Midwestern states are changing demographically, and they're definitely changing enough to create a set of tensions, and I'll go into that in a minute. But what I think people need to understand is that they are indeed changing. So this picture shows the darkest blue is where there's the biggest racial change. And you'll notice that that is not just in the Twin Cities, it is all across the state. And so when we think of rural people or like people from small towns as being white men, we do not have the right picture of who lives in the Midwest. Worthington, which is a very small town, has majority kids of color in the school district, and you would see that pattern all across the state. So the states are changing demographically, but not at the same pace as they're changing in other parts of the country. All right, next slide. So this is created as that picture of demographic change plus the story that I told you about growing up in Iowa, or the story that people could tell you about what happened to manufacturing in places like Michigan and Ohio and Western Pennsylvania, or the story about the farm crisis and how agriculture became corporatized. The mix of radical economic restructuring and demographic change has created a kind of intense polarization. So these are pictures of the presidential results from 2008 through 2016. And these polarizations work on rural versus urban. They are highly partisan and polarized, and race and gender and class are hot. So the way that those things are playing out in policymaking and politics and all those things creates a kind of, we've used this amongst our Midwestern colleagues, it creates a kind of toxic stew that we have to navigate politically. Next slide. So that stew creates fertile ground for what we call right-wing populism or Trumpism. So these are real headlines from Minnesota, and this is the kind of conversation that's going on out in public, in real towns, in real places, on the ground, on the doors, in the church basements, at the schools. This is what people are swimming in. So there is the virulence of this racialized, weaponized politics that trades on polarization and also trades on what has been somewhat of a vacuum of another story that would give people a picture of why the things are happening, what politics mean, and what the future would be, has been missing. So therefore, Minnesota taxpayers burdened by immigrants, Islamists and Sharia laws coming to St. Cloud, Muslims are infiltrating the political system. That is the daily thing that a lot of regular people are swimming in. And oftentimes there's not anything to give another story. So if this is the story, if this is the primary story that people are swimming in, then Trump wins. Okay, next slide. A little bit of a picture that, let's go back to that. I want to go back to that 77,000 votes, because the 77,000 votes weren't predetermined, but this sort of decade-long story I'm telling you about actually has a trajectory, and it is revealing about the strategy of the other side. So these states had this contest has really been going on for a long time, and so what you see in this timeline is the emergence of the Tea Party, the ability of that Tea Party to take over state legislatures in 2008, 2009, and 2010 was the main pivot point. And then a set of radical structural changes that were passed across our states that suppressed the vote, attacked public sector unions, and launched culture wars. That dynamic, if you suppress the vote, if you take all of the power away from the strength of the labor movement in these states with right to work laws, then it's not very surprising that this vote would be suppressed by 77,000 across Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So the question is, if you look at this and you think about what opposition parties of some of the opposition has done over the last 10 years, the thing that's sort of exciting about it, I know this is a sad story, but what's exciting about it is what you can see in the decisions of passing voter ID laws, gerrymandering, and redistricting. Next slide. Passing austerity rules and attacking unions, is it reveals the way that this movement, the conservative movement in the Midwest is actually vulnerable. And the reason they're vulnerable is because there are actually more of us than there are of them. And especially if we are organizing an emergent majority, we are giving that majority a path, we are filling it with a story that gives a sense of a future politics that brings race and class and a multiracial democratic vision moving forward, will win. So that, what passing voter ID laws, austerity, and attacking labor unions says is that that's actually their vulnerability. So we are at a crossroads right now where we absolutely can win. We absolutely can organize the emergent majority in our states. And I want to look at the next slide. There they are. That's some of them. If we organize this path, then we, in 2020, we can not only beat Trump in 2020, but we can actually chart a course to a progressive decade, as Billy likes to say. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Art to talk a little bit about what this looks like in Michigan, concretely.
Great. Hey folks, really, really good to be on this call, to see a lot of your faces. We're gonna shift away from the slides for a minute because I'd like to see as many of your faces as possible. So just to start, I think there is not a point in time, particularly right now, where the fate of our country is not determined by us as organizations, people's organizations in the Midwest, coming together to build the power necessary for us to shift our states and shift the country. And we're very focused on what that looks like. I want to just introduce myself briefly. I'm the founding director of We the People Michigan. And just a little bit about me, when I was in the 2nd or 3rd grade, I had a weird habit. I would call my friends on the phone and I'd count how long it took them to answer the phone, 13, 14, 15. And as soon as I got off the phone with them, I would run to my mom and I would say, Mom, it took Dan 25 seconds to get to the phone. They must have a super nice house. See, we lived in a trailer and I wanted so bad to live in a house like my other friends from school. My mom would look at me with her strong eyes and say, we'll get there someday. And that idea of getting there someday, that's been pervasive throughout my family's history. My family came to Flint, Michigan, where I grew up in the 1940s and 50s as migrant workers from Texas, because at that point, Flint was a beacon of hope for working people. My family came for union jobs in the auto factories. And when I was growing up, things were changing rapidly. I was growing up during the first wave of layoffs and then plant closures. What that meant for me was seeing my family and community begin to lose work, slip back into poverty, lose the stability that they had had for a couple of decades, and watched as Flint went from the 1950s highest per capita income city in the country to today, the single poorest city in America with an ongoing water crisis. 4 years ago, I was sitting in my office in Boston. I was the national training director for an organization called the Center for Popular Democracy. And my friend Wani, who I'd grown up with, called me. She had just left the house of an undocumented family on the east side of Flint. And she said, Art, they just found out about the water crisis when Obama declared a state of emergency. They tried to go get water from an official distribution center that was set up by the state, but they were turned away because they didn't have ID. And in Michigan, undocumented people had their right to IDs taken away in 2008. The grocery store in their neighborhood had been raided by ICE 2 weeks prior, so they were afraid to go to the grocery store to buy water, and they had an 11-month-old child. The mom had been drinking the water and breastfeeding, and the weight of it was hitting them that for the entire life of their kid, that the water had been tainted. For me, this is a visceral kick in the gut hearing this, because it was the same neighborhood that my family had moved to in the 40s and 50s as a beacon of hope. And I think it's important that we contextualize what the reality of this means for many of our communities, because for us, it's not just wins or losses the day after the election. It's what happens to our communities when we don't have the policies or power driven by our communities to get the change that we need. I want to set a little bit of the context in Michigan. So for us, for me, We the People is a young organization. We launched about 3 years ago. After that experience, and then of going home for the water crisis and organizing there, and then watching the 2016 election where Donald Trump took the state by less than 11,000 votes. For me, it felt like home was burning, and I needed to be home. And so almost 3 years ago, we launched We the People Michigan, which is doing multiracial working class organizing across the state of Michigan, starting with me in my car doing about 200 one-to-ones over the summer to now 20 full-time staff spread across the state, an additional kind of 12 county part-time temporary county leads leading our statewide deep canvas program. But the context that we're in that I think is really, really important to lift up because it's similar in many Midwestern places. Some of the challenges are acute in Michigan. Michigan is one of the most segregated places in the United States. As a whole, our state is between 75 and 80% white. Our largest city by far is the city of Detroit, which is 90+% people of color, about 80% Black. When we have that combined with multi-generational economic devastation in places like Flint, Detroit, Pontiac, Benton Harbor, many cities that are predominantly people of color, but also the entire Upper Peninsula, huge chunks of rural parts of our state that have also faced the same disinvestment, the same multi-generational economic devastation. What we've created is a fertile ground for divide and conquer politics, a politics of fear, a politics that tells some communities the reason for your pain is because of other communities that are also in pain. And that's what we've been dealing with in places like Michigan. And when we have that as the scenario combined with oftentimes a very sophisticated corporate conservative organizing infrastructure that have been able to drive a playbook that Doran just described. While often in progressive communities, we've been laser focused only on the short term, only on the next election ahead of us, often seeing our communities as bodies and numbers that are instrumental in elections, as opposed to supporting people's organizations and communities that can see elections as instrumental in building the power that we need to have to transform our state, our region, and our country. So for me, I wanted to set a little bit of that context, and I want to shift gears in a second. We're going to show you all a video here in a second. But what we're focused on, we know deeply in our bones that we are going to transform the politics of Michigan. That will not be because we, the people alone, as an organization does this. It'll be because we have an ecosystem of organizations that are rooted in their communities, that are fighting for the soul of our state so that we can fight for the soul of our country. And we're doing that every single day. But for us, it's incredibly important that we're focused on what is the long-term work that we need to do to make sure that things like the 2020 election don't slip us into very dangerous authoritarian populism, but also that things like the Flint water crisis can never happen again in our communities. And so as we're facing yet another crisis, we've gotten used to some crisis in places like Michigan after a decade of austerity. We know that we need to be building the foundation, which a number of organizations are building, that are focused on long-term, strong organizing, not seeing our people as bodies and numbers to be moved around during an election, but rather as leaders, as agents, as human beings who have the potential to come together across race, across community, across geography to determine the future of our state and of the region. So right now, as many folks know, Michigan has been hit particularly hard in the midst of this COVID crisis. In part, we've had a decade or a decade and a half of austerity in many communities like Flint and Detroit. That's made us particularly vulnerable for especially poor communities and communities of color to be cut through rapidly by this COVID crisis. I know for me, today is day 29 of one of my little cousins, he's only 28 years old, on a ventilator as this crisis has moved through so many of our communities. We've seen deaths happening at very, very rapid rates, now over 4,000 deaths that we've had in the state of Michigan. And so when these moments face us, we know the predominant feelings that so many of our communities have are fear, anxiety, increasingly grief, and panic. And when that's the emotional state that our communities are in, we're very susceptible to right-wing authoritarian populism. When that is the predominant feelings for what, so we have to be able to break through. Almost 8 weeks ago, immediately as this crisis was unfolding, over 100 grassroots organizations in Michigan came together to form MI COVID Community, which is a coalition driving a proactive set of demands saying we need our communities to be safe, but we also need to use this. That is a glaring mirror on so many of the inequities that our communities are facing. We need to use this moment to fix these crises that have been ongoing in so many of our communities. And so that effort, pulling together a huge amount of folks, is really important, because not only do we have to face this challenge right now, we have to fight the narrative battle that the right is fighting right now in Michigan. They've made Michigan the central battleground of the narrative around COVID because they want to continue driving a fear narrative through the election, and we can't let that happen. A little over a week ago, this coalition launched a week of action with a video that I want to show you on here. I know we have one of my kind of dear friends who also works with the Movement Voter Project in the College of Miller Martin, who was instrumental in putting this together too, with a set of grassroots organizations. I'm going to show this video and then talk a little bit about this moment before we move on, but it's important that we're recognizing this moment.
It comes down to a simple choice. On April 30th, will the legislature sacrifice people's lives for an economy that only works for the 1%? Or will they provide real economic relief and safety for everyone? No exceptions.
In over just 6 weeks, we've mourned the loss of 2,500 loved ones. Over 31,000 Michiganders are still battling this disease, some in crowded conditions behind bars.
At the same time, millions are facing unimaginable hardships, many that have existed already and now have been amplified by this pandemic.
We shouldn't have to choose between our lives or our livelihood. In our Michigan, no one gets left behind.
Decidimos ser protegidos y seguros con quedarnos en casa, cuidar de nuestros seres queridos, vecinos y los que están en el pie del cañón.
Over the next 8 days, we Michiganders are taking action on issues that are important to us. We're asking our legislature to extend the state of emergency, the stay-at-home order, and provide relief and safety for all of us, no exceptions.
Join us by emailing or tweeting your legislators and sharing your story today.
So the last thing that I want to say, just lifting up on that video, one, that video was pulled together in less than 12 hours, entirely volunteer with zero budget. That was no money. It has now been viewed over 60,000 times on Facebook, and had a playthrough rate of, or had a playthrough of about 20,000 folks. So over a third of the people who saw that video watched the entire thing. I was like, oh, that seems kind of good. Haven't dug deeply into the digital organizing space, and was talking to someone there, like the average is between 1% and 2%. You're at over a third of people that have seen this are watching the entire thing. For us, this is really important. That was the kickoff of our week of action. At that point, there was 2,500 deaths. That was about 10 days ago. Today, there are 4,200 deaths. So just in these 10 days, this is how rapidly this is moving in Michigan right now. On Thursday, many folks saw Michigan in the national spotlight as armed protesters stormed the Capitol, tried to force their way on the House floor. For me, it was very jarring seeing people with long rifles in the gallery of the Senate and the House. As that was going on, though, at the same time, we were putting on an 8-hour-long People's Telethon that over 20,000 people in the state tuned into at some point. This was folks, Black, Brown, Native, white, and rural communities, suburbs, cities, coming together, sharing stories, calling people to action, sharing demands, singing, cooking, knitting together. We laughed with Kerry Washington. We strategized with Naomi Klein. We were doing all of these things, and it is a stark contrast to what the media showed, which is a fearful small group of people that will lose in the end, versus what we experienced that same day, which was the future. It was people multiracially across community coming together, having each other's backs, demonstrating ways that we care for each other, love each other, and are willing to fight not only for our own communities, but for each other. And that's the way forward. We know that is the way forward, and we're committed to continuing that. It's incredibly important that this is anchored in organizations that are actually building with people in their communities, because the exposure of all of this could have never happened if this was a flashy national digital campaign that came from DC. These are people who know us, who we know, they're neighbors who we care about. And that's incredibly important for the pathway forward of how we break through a politics of fear that has dominated in the Midwest for too long. And so really grateful for the opportunity for the conversation. I know we're gonna go back to Doran to hear some things before we hear from Prentiss, but gratitude for folks for listening to the work that's driving in Michigan.
Okay. I hope I won't be too boring following that. I have a few more like wonky things to show you, which are like about how we systematically leverage the kind of community base that Art is describing in terms of actually winning elections. So what I want to contend to the folks on this call is that I mean the MVP, the Movement Voter Project, organizing organizations across the Midwest are actually perfectly positioned as we sort of enter an election in the era of COVID, where we might have to do it without seeing people in person. So how are we going to pivot our work? We were already piloting and talking about how to do scaled electoral relational organizing. So this, what is relational organizing? In short, relational organizing is people talking to people they are connected to do both persuasion and turnout. So traditional electoral field, and a lot of what we're invited to invest in, has to do with cold contacts. So the whole structure is about someone I don't know sends me a lot of political ads on my Facebook or on my TV. Someone I don't know knocks on my door once or maybe twice, if we're lucky, and someone I don't know calls me on the phone. So those are like cold and kind of two-dimensional tactics. They're not unimportant. That is actually an important part of scaled voter engagement. But there has been an ongoing conversation about, in the era of disinformation, fear, and isolation, how are we actually getting to people based on people talking to people that they know? And what we know from research the last 4 years is that it's actually the most effective, but can it scale? That's the question. So and I'll give you one example of what this could actually look like. And if we scaled it across Minnesota and Michigan and Wisconsin and Ohio and, et cetera, it is a powerful path forward in 2020 and beyond. So next slide. So basically, we believe that this can scale, and it's why we should, our organization should be doubling down on integrated relational voter engagement. So this picture right here comes from our pilot in Faith in Minnesota and Isaiah that we did in 2019 in St. Paul around a low salience local election that was actually about trash. I won't go into the details, but the point is it was about collective solutions, so in public investments. So we hired researchers who came in and tracked our program. And what you see right here in September when we started the program is the person in the middle is one organizer connected to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 what we call super leaders. So super leaders are essentially volunteer organizers. We used a technology platform called Empower. We invited our super leaders to then build a team of 25 or 30 people. So the second picture in October is they got trained and they built that. They built this next kind of layer of people. And then the next step was for those people to talk to like basically multiple contacts 4 or 5 times to people that they knew in persuasion conversations about this referendum. So what you see is from September to November, one organizer moved 3,500 votes through this program. So one canvasser doesn't move 3,500 votes. So this is, the other thing I wanna say is we also moved our digital programming through this relational network. So instead of getting content from a stranger or like an organization I've never heard of, people actually got content from people that they knew on Facebook. And we also have some research that shows that it's about 3 times more effective in terms of persuasion to get a message from someone you know on Facebook rather than being napalmed by like some national organization with Facebook ads. So that is another thing to really be thinking about as we pivot towards digital, is people talking to people and people moving content to other people is what creates connection that Art is talking about, and it also creates the capacity for persuasion. All right, next slide. So the results of this little minimal pilot we did in St. Paul is that we won the referendum. This is not just us, but there was an overall 14% turnout increase, and this was a lot us and our crew, a tripled turnout in Muslim precincts in St. Paul. So what we're doing now is creating a path to build a scaled program in which our leaders and organizers are moving 150,000 votes in key Senate districts and for the presidential race. And other organizations across Minnesota are doing the same thing. And we want to do the same thing across the Midwest. And that needs resources, and it is an incredible resource. Basically, we need resources to make sure that the leader-rich bases that are connected to real community organizations can actually move an electoral program that looks like this. All right, next slide. And all of that is critical to this question of how we're changing the narrative. So for that, I'll give it to Prentiss.
Thank you. So I'm gonna just recap a little bit what we said so far. The 3 things that we need to, like how we win in the Midwest, in how do we mobilize our winning coalitions. One, breaking through isolation in this moment. Two, putting organizing back at the center, using relational tactics to make sure that our networks of community organizing are contacting people we need to win. And the third thing is changing the story. So my name is Prentiss Haney, and a little bit about me before we jump into this is that I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, which is like a post-industrial city. And my mom and my dad are both self-employed small business owners. A beautician, my mom, and my dad is a lawn care provider. And why this is so important about the story of Ohio, over the last couple of years, the story of Ohio has, in the public arena, has shifted and shaped, talking about working class voters, talking about an aging population, talking about things that folks don't actually know about what the real story is in Ohio, which is connected to why we need to change the story that's happening here. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about my mother. My mother, who bought a house in 2001 for me and my sister, bought a house with a subprime loan. And over the course of a number of years, by the time we got to 2008, she was trying to figure out how she was going to make the payments that were starting to increase. And so me being her child, I am not being told what is happening in the world, but I can see how she's interacting with her family differently, how she is trying to figure out her credit card bills differently, how is she showing up in the world differently. And one of the things that I learned as I went to college and I started to learn about how the world actually works and how my mom showed up because of choices and policies that were happening in our state and around the country, that she showed up with a shame. She had shame in her body about why she could not take care of her family the way she wanted to. And the reason why this is so critical is that post-2008, what we see in the Midwest, and especially in Ohio, is people like my mother, a Black mother, are told that if you cannot take care of your family, if you cannot make things happen, you should feel that shame and you should be silent. And then coupled with the right-wing strategy to suppress voters, to make sure that the conversation is not about how we change the country, the shame and the silence stops the people who can show up and change our state from showing up. And simultaneously, white voters in our state was being told to be loud and angry, and then to point the finger at the person of color or the person you thought was lazy, and that you should show up and you should raise your voice. And when you have a story in the hearts and minds of Ohio voters that believe that, and then structural systems that are holding back voters in the Midwest, Ohio voters, that Democratic base that Doran showed earlier, while we're voting on the same pattern, the Democratic base that would show up are not showing up at the rates they could show up because of the structural barriers and because of the story of shame and silence. So I have some good news for you, if you could bring back the slide up, is that story about shame and silence is starting to die because of the work we've been doing to build out this winning coalition over the last 3 years. Can you go back? So the reason why this is so important, we said at the very beginning that we have to break the isolation. What do you think happens when the coalition you need to win is ashamed of their lives and are told that they shouldn't show up and have structural barriers? They lean into that story and don't show up how they need to show up. So what has happened in the last couple of weeks and has been propelled by the work we've been doing to change the narrative in Ohio is that because of COVID, because of the story we're telling about how we can work together, what we see the Ohio electorate starting to respond to is that while our governor, who's a Republican, is telling a story about being in it together, and we're constructing our own narrative path about what our winning coalition, they are starting to see the hope that they felt in 2008 and 2012. And that is literally changing everything about the politics in Ohio. Because who is the antithesis of hope? Who is not fighting for change? Who is not breaking up the shame? Donald Trump. And so maybe Ohio is not out of reach, and this is because of the organizing work and the narrative work we've been doing. So next slide. First thing that you need to know that we are implementing a race class narrative creative campaign in Ohio. And if you don't remember anything, part of how you change the story is remembering this phrase that Anat says all the time, is that if your words don't spread, they don't work. And so in order to change the narrative of the state, you not only have to create a narrative that's resonant and changes the weather of what you need to see happen, breaks through the isolation, you have to organize the people in the ecosystem that carry stories, and you have to organize a massive base of people who can disseminate those stories so that when they come together, they see the world that they want to believe in, acting in public together. So what we've, since March, it seems like it's so long ago, we've launched a creative campaign called All In for Ohio. And in this creative campaign, part of the theory of the case of why we launched this All In for Ohio brand is that we needed a narrative that did three things. One, that create a landing path for us to define who is all of us. And in this moment, all of us are the essential workers, are the loved ones with people who are on the inside. All of us are the caretakers and the teachers. All of us are the voters who didn't know how to vote during the vote by mail primary in Ohio. And so we get to define on our terms who all of us is. We needed a message, second thing we needed a message to do, a narrative to do, was to be durable enough to withstand this moment and to show up in the fall. So all in Ohio is a response to COVID-19 because, all in fine. We can show up, separately but apart. Can you go to the next slide? But we also needed a message that could also then become a mobilization message for the fall. They could be durable enough to show up when we need to actually fight for our issues and get people to the poll. And then the last thing is, next slide. The last thing is we needed a message that could alienate Trump. So one of the things that we created as a creative in this campaign is these folders, these posters is All In for Ohio, Stronger Apart, Together We Rise. Part of what we're developing in this moment, in this opportunity where the whole nation is talking about being together, is we're defining what being together means for an Ohioan and how being together and how you can exercise being together in the political arena. And then the only way that that is going to be able to break through the noise is if we have regular people, grassroots folks, as Doran said, that are carrying the message. So what we saw happen just a couple weeks ago is that in our primary, we had over 400 volunteers contacting voters across the state, both relational and through cold text. So this multiplier effect about when you have actual member leaders contacting folks is that they have better conversations, they talk to more people that they know, and then they are able to move people even through cold contact. So what we saw happen, especially in Hamilton County, is that when we put the message All In for Ohio into the conversation, when our volunteers talked to those voters and they defined who All In for Ohio was, they alienated Trump, they alienated the people who were against that. When they talked about, what this election means, they were able to help propel a candidate forward. And so what we saw happen in Hamilton County is that in the areas that we had our messaging strongest, we had our volunteers talking about being All In for Ohio, but who's a part of that, and there was a sheriff candidate, Charmaine, who represented that. So we saw that the candidate that she was running against in the primary, who was a Trump-supporting candidate who wanted to deport immigrants from our community, was ousted in that election and was able to get over that margin of victory because of the messages that they heard from our volunteers in this primary. So this is the power of what the story can do if you can create the space. Next slide. So one more slide. So the last thing I want you to leave with here is that we have a very short window to claim the narrative of our state. So what I'm showing you here is that the week before our primary, which was April 28th, right here, All In for Ohio, we outspent Donald Trump in our state with our message. While that is great that happened the week before the primary, that will not be true throughout the rest of this year. But what's more important is that All In for Ohio and the message that our ecosystem carries and the message that our grassroots leaders carry performed better than the right-wing populist message that has been dominating our state for the last 4 years. So our opportunity right now is that we have to break through the noise and make sure that we have a durable enough narrative that is organized through the progressive infrastructure and your grassroots infrastructure to create the landing pad for voters to show up on election day and say that they're all in for democracy, all in for Ohio, all in for Black voters, even all in for Joe Biden, if that's what we need. And then that's how you create a space for people to get there. So I'm going to pass it back off to Laura. Oh, wait, actually, no, one more thing. So last thing I'm going to say about this is that we have to create tons of creative content that people can see themselves reflected. So I'm going to show you, this is one video that will describe what it could look like for us to be all in for Ohio, and how when we put this creative content into the world and we disseminate it to our leaders, it can be really powerful. And before we press play, I want to say shout out to the Solution Project, who works with artists to create these sort of videos for our movement. So thank you for them for helping support us on this project.
When the impossible now happens daily, it's time we recognize that we define what possible means. We cannot go back to business as usual, because business as usual is what created this crisis. For too long, the few have had their say over the many by keeping us divided. We can make sure we have what we need to get and stay well. Because the future is what we do together.
Thank you. So that video and all the work that I showed you is a part of a 6-state strategy that we're working together called the Midwest RCN strategy. We understand that the right-wing populist message in our state is one that we have to beat back and create the organizing army that can spread news stories to allow us to get to election day and turn out the voters we need. And so if you want to learn more about the Midwest Project around the RCN and the research, we'll make sure to share that out at a different point.
Okay, I'm gonna jump in here why don't we pull up the slides again? Alex, great. So we're gonna hold our last question until the Q&A, ask each of our speakers what it's gonna mean to win in their communities. But I think first we should move to what groups need right now, because this is the urgency that's in front of us. I love that video. I want to see that video play. I know actually it is playing. It's playing in Minnesota today. We're getting it through all kinds of messaging from groups across our state, and I'm sure it's hitting in other states as well. So what are the kinds of tools that our groups need right now in this, to face the election, but also to pivot in this pandemic moment? And so the first is remote organizing tools, the kind of tools that Doran was talking about, like Empower and other digital organizing tools. Support for state and local voter protection. So almost all of the groups that we partner with across the Midwest are fighting for vote by mail. They're fighting for extended early balloting, just to expand the capacity for our people to vote and to vote safely. And then they need funds to support staff and communities. Some funding has been pulled as a result of shifts among foundation priorities in this COVID moment. So all of our groups need support to keep their staff on payroll, and also to support their larger community, volunteers who are now out of work and having to support their families, their children are at home. So really they need a much larger budget to do that kind of work. And then lastly, to have mutual aid in order to grow their organizing base. A lot of times when we talk about mutual aid, which would be, financial support in this desperate time provided by peers, so peer-to-peer financial support and material support. We think of that as charity and separate from the electoral work, but it really is a key piece of how we're going to hold these communities together and continue to engage them around what they need right now in order for them to be able to show up in November. So those are the four directions that MVP has been focusing on in our funding in this moment. Mutual aid is organizing, says Joseph. And next slide. So this is what you can do right now. Billy, do you want to jump in here and remind us what we need to win the Midwest?
Yeah, well, first, let's just get our energy up. I know we can't hear each other, but I'm going to start a little chant, win the Midwest, win the Midwest. And you can join in, win the Midwest, win the Midwest.
Win the Midwest.
Win the Midwest. Win the Midwest.
Win the Midwest.
Midwest.
Win the Midwest.
Midwest.
Win the Midwest.
What we're going to do is
In the Midwest.
people are in all sorts of different situations in terms of what you can move. Everyone can donate online and share and spread this opportunity. So we created a special Midwest fund, which we're going to make sure all the groups on this call get and others. And then, but honestly, we want to spread that far and wide so people know about this. And then we also want people to donate larger amounts. You can contact us directly or contact the groups, or we can put you in touch with any of the groups on this call today if you want to give to them directly or want more details. So yeah, and what's needed again across the Midwest is on the order of over $100 million, right? So that you're not going to give too much, right? And I don't know if anyone wants to ask any more detailed questions, but you know, the constellations of groups in these states need millions and millions and tens of millions of dollars. So, and they need a lot of it now so they can make big decisions about hiring and growth, basically. So I'll pass it back to you, Laura.
Sorry, I was muted. So we're going to move to question and answers, and like you guys to use the chat. If you want to pose a question, we'll start calling through them. But I wanted to start off, can we have that other slide? I want to start off with a question to each of the three speakers to tell us, you know, beyond the numbers and what it, you know, the what we're going to see on after election day of who turned out where and what where we won. What will it actually mean for you and for your communities to win? What can it's really hard in this moment. I think things are so bad that it feels almost bad to talk about winning, but I think it's also important that we try to imagine what might be possible if we can win across our state. So I want to turn to each of you to give us a picture of what that's going to look like on November 4th in your state. Maybe start with Doran.
So in the last week, as much as we're organizing towards this future, what we've also been confronting is the largest Islamic center in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Over 100 of the workers from the meatpacking plant have come down with COVID, and those people are in our base. And the conversation we've been having with the organizers and with the team is not a conversation about despair, but a conversation about how hungry we are for people to experience hope and power in this moment. And that's actually what people want. So sometimes we think there's like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs where like the feeling of agency and dignity is somehow at the top of the pyramid. And like, you know, feeding ourselves or staying healthy is at the bottom of the pyramid, when actually it's the image is actually that solving that problem together, like mutual aid is organizing, is the path to power, and it's the path to dignity, and it's the path to health and safety. So my passion is, can we not only win, but win in such a way that those people and our people are at the very epicenter of the future of what the Midwest looks like. And I don't think we're that far from that kind of power. And it's that kind of power and experience which actually sets the stage for a virtuous cycle, as opposed to a vicious one, where people start to feel like politics works for them. And when politics works for people, they keep investing in politics. And that's what we have to build through this cycle. And I think we have the opportunity to do it.
Great. Why don't we pass that on to Art? Same question to you. What's it going to mean to your community and people to win on November 4th?
Yeah. So, a couple of years ago, what felt like the actual launch of We the People Michigan was when we kind of ratified our proactive people's agenda. And for us, what's so important in this moment right now is we have to be able to aspire. Like, we have to not just say, let's prevent these bad things from happening again and again and again, but actually talk about what's the beautiful future that we are going to have together, that this election is a part of. It's not the whole thing, but it's a part of it. The number of campaigns and issue fights and things that people have. And I think at the end of the day, for me, just two quick things that I'd want to share. One is I want people to know that they did this, right? That the power is in our hands, and that it matters when communities show up and fight for each other, and show up across rural and urban and suburban communities to actually stand together and say, this is our state, this is our country, and we're the ones who are going to be able to drive the future. But that's really important. But I also want to make sure that people understand the tangible things that we can win in our state. If we actually do, I know one of the questions, which I think we'll get to, is we are fighting for a state legislative majority in Michigan. That's really critical. And one of the issues, for instance, we've been driving a campaign on access to driver's license for undocumented people. And one of our organizers that is just very dear to my heart always says, the first thing, she asks everybody, what's the first thing you're going to do when you get a driver's license? And the trope is always like, people need driver's license so they can take their kids to the doctor or to school. But she's like, I'm gonna take my son to the lake, because she lives in West Michigan, and such an important part of the culture of living in West Michigan is being able to pick up and have a picnic on the beach and go and drive to the lake and watch the sunset. And she doesn't get to do that because she worries about getting pulled over, arrested, and potentially deported and ripped away from her family. She wants to be able to take her son to the lake. And we have so many instances of our people that know what they're gonna do when we win victory. And it's really important for us to be grounded in that. And I want us to be able to imagine tangibly what that means for my family, for our neighbors, for our loved ones, for the people in our communities.
Great, thank you, Art. Let's throw that same question to Prentiss. What's it gonna feel like?
Yeah. I mean, echo everything everyone said. And the only thing I would add is that, success looks like our member leaders, our volunteers, Ohioans, coming out of the November election, feeling like their contribution was not only compassionate, but also that their contribution created a more dignified political process. That because they showed up, because they actually showed how they cared, that politics reflect more who they are and less of what we're trying to stop.
Thank you. Awesome. Okay, bunch of questions here. I'm going to start with, it seems like people want to hear more about race class narrative and this coordinated regional work that you all are doing. So I can toss that whoever wants to take it to kind of give us a quick rundown of what that works look like. Doran, you want to
do it?
Yeah, Doran, you take it. And then
Okay.
Here's the next one.
Did you just call me dear?
No, I said Doran.
Sorry. I was like, well. Yeah, so we have a kind of formal project called the Midwest Race Class Narrative Project. It's a partnership of state-based organizing groups across Midwestern states that launched basically coming out of the 2018 pilot, in which Minnesota, Ohio, and Indiana piloted doing race class narrative research and then implementation in the 2018 cycle. And we wanted to take it to the next level going into 2020 and beyond. And so there's lots and lots to say about it. I'll give you the short version. We've exited the research phase. So we've completed very extensive public opinion research that is state specific and regional. And now we're moving into an implementation phase. So the implementation phase is we're building kind of a shared hub that will produce shared content like the Don Cheadle video that you just saw, but then also working all the way down so that there are state-rooted expressions that are built on the evidence base of the public opinion research. So All In for Ohio is an example of that. In Minnesota, we had the Greater Than Fear campaign. The Michigan groups are kind of in the process. The Michigan COVID response was one step down that path, and they're talking about like, what is a Michigan centered expression of multiracial populism in Michigan, and how are they going to move that forward? So Art is anchoring that in Michigan, and Prentiss is anchoring it in Ohio, and there's a whole set of us anchoring it in Minnesota. And in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania was a part of that research project, along with Missouri and Wisconsin. Yes, that's it. That's all the states. So I can certainly give people, the three of us could give people more information about that. There's literally hundreds of slides of the public research. So there's, we'd have to curate it.
Yeah, the research on it is really powerful. It is really important for how we're shaping a lot of our work. That video that I showed earlier in Michigan that we put together really quickly, a very grassroots way, was done using, the script is done using race class narrative around some of that. We're actually right now trying to put together a quick video to just kind of showcase the difference between what was happening in the Capitol last week versus this like big multiracial expression that we built together. And I think the thing that's really important is like race class narrative is a really, really powerful tool, but it has to be reflective of the work that we're actually doing. The reason it's powerful is because we're credible around this, because we're actually driving multiracial work. So one just example of that is last Thursday at the beginning of our 8-hour-long telethon, we had a really powerful organizer and poet, a Black mother, share a poem about her experience of raising a Black son and what that is like, particularly right now in this moment. That was followed up by two working class Upper Peninsula, or Yoopers as they call themselves, two folks who said, look, Lee Chatfield, who's the Speaker of our House, who's their representative, Lee Chatfield talks all the time about representing Northern Michigan, but he doesn't represent us. We have more in common with you who just shared this poem. Like our faiths are linked, and got people in Lee Chatfield's district calling him on the telethon that day saying, Lee Chatfield, this is not the future that we want. We stand with other folks across the state. So it has to be reflective of how we're doing that. And we have to do that like all of the time. And so the race class narrative work is really beautiful because it gives us some language and strategy in some of the specific strategic communications work. But at the end of the day, it's an expression of the multiracial organizing work that all of us are trying to build in the Midwest.
Okay, a next question, maybe quickly. Are there Senate governor and state house races in your states? There's state house races in all our states, right? And even if we can't win, we got to make it less bad. I think that's the range. But do you guys want to just quickly say what races you're focusing on beyond the presidential? Prentiss, why don't you start?
Yeah, I'll go. So in Ohio, there's a number of House districts and Senate districts we're focusing on, but the ones that our organization is focused on is in Cincinnati, so House District 28 and 27, and then House District 43 in Dayton. And part of why we're focusing on those districts is that we believe that the base of people that we have, like the people that we call missing voters, could like help flip the break the supermajority of Republicans until we can change the lines next year when we go through our redistricting process.
Yeah, Art and Doran, you want to just jump in on that?
Yeah, the state legislature
said it.
Go ahead.
That's all I
Go
gotta
ahead.
say.
Yeah, the state legislature is critical in Michigan. It's had conservative control since 2010, continuously through. And for example, things that are happening right now our state legislature is trying to very quickly pull together a ballot initiative to hamper the governor's executive powers to basically continue on this narrative that they're drumming up right now, that that actually this is about liberty and personal freedom and using it to stoke right-wing populism. That's being discussed right now. So taking back our state legislature is absolutely critical, and it's possible in the House for us to do that. And there's a number of local races that are really, really important too.
Well, I'll just say here in Minnesota, we only need to win 2 state Senate seats and we will have trifecta control of the state of Minnesota, open the door to passing progressive legislation across the board. So we are laser focused. We're going to win 2 to 3 to 10 of those seats, and mostly women candidates. Is very exciting. Okay, going back to the question. So this seems like an important one. How effective is relational organizing when Trump voters are so dug in?
We could do, a 2-hour session on relational organizing. So I tried to cram like a day-long seminar into about 5 minutes in those slides. There's been a lot of research about relational organizing. It is, by the fancy people who do such research. I showed you one of the Analyst Institute slides. The question out in the world has been, how do you scale it? So what we've been working on as organizing organizations kind of across the region, across the country, is building models to scale relational organizing. And there's 2 big buckets of of thinking about where it fits. So one bucket is persuasion and the other bucket is turnout, which is also persuasion. So it's sort of like, I would think a little bit less about the Trump voter and more about like who it is we need to motivate, inspire, and move to vote, which is as much persuasion. I think that's part of like what Prentiss and Art and I have been saying in different ways. It's like the challenge in the Midwest is that we actually have an electorate that we need to expand. And then the other thing we have to do is bring some of the persuadables with us. So the persuadables in this case, this is kind of what they're not just white people. The persuadables are people who regularly don't vote or don't know if it matters. And then there's a set of people who, if they hear only the right-wing populist drumbeat, it has one of 2 impacts. It confuses and it distracts. It doesn't necessarily convince people that, the way I sort of say it, doesn't necessarily convince people that Hillary Clinton actually ran a pedophile wing outside of a pizza store. What it does is make you think a pox on both their houses. I don't even know what's going on. And it animates people's racism and fear. So what we're trying to do is say, we need our base, like our people, like completely equipped, both relationally in their own communities, and also like with an echo chamber kind of outscaled, like strategic scaled public communications that pulls those people with us and our base. So the purpose of the relational organizing is that we are equipping trusted messengers to do the persuading and the engaging and the mobilizing, rather than it only being cold contacts. That is how I would think about what is the function of relational organizing in the context of these states. And I want you to go back and remember the 77,000 votes. So if our organizations are talking to tens of thousands of people, if we are moving, we're looking at some of our Senate districts, if we move 2,000 to 3,000 votes of people who are not in the calculus of people who normally vote, we win. And if we can do that while we're also like inoculating against the right-wing populist message and taking Trump's only weapon away from him, and the conservatives' only weapon away from him, which is like outright racist, toxic stuff that divides, distracts, confuses, and makes cynical, then we can pull the number of people with us that we need to win. But we're not trying to convert Trump voters. Not many of them. There's not enough of them.
Some people are passive Trump voters, but they may have voted for Trump, but they're not. They're not hardcore. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go to another. Can you talk a little bit about education around vote by mail, which is obviously going to be a huge part of all of our TV. Prentiss, you want to go?
Can I talk about that real quick? Yeah.
Yep.
I want to answer this, and also I saw a question from Susan about vote by mail systems earlier.
Yeah.
So I don't know about the other states. I think probably Minnesota has the better system, but Ohio has a pretty bad vote by mail system. And so in Ohio, 85% of voters vote in person. And then when you look into the universe, we just did a universe, like baseline dim voters, 1/3 of them have never voted by mail prior to this primary. And then the entire motivation universe in the state of Ohio, which is mostly Black voters and young voters, virtually none of them have ever voted by mail. And so we have to do a twofold plan this year. One, we have to get some election reforms so that like people don't have to request an absentee application and then mail that in and then get their ballot and then get another stamp, and they don't have to do all these steps, too many things. So we need to like simplify the process. So we're working right now to like do some advocacy and organized work to simplify the process, and also understanding that it may not work or it may only get somewhat simpler, which means that we then have to prepare that if nothing changes, how do we turn out and request upwards to 3 million vote by mail applications and then track those people to the polls at the end by November. So we're in the process right now of building out a new plan that starts as early as June to start tracking those voters all the way to the end. But there's some good news. What it takes to get a person to fill out an application early on and then take them through the process to vote later in the year is an organizing conversation. And so our organizations on this call are well positioned, more than most organizations, because we can actually have the conversations now and over the course of a couple months to get them ready for the election. So the actual request phase is now an organizing conversation and a process of them being indoctrinated as leaders in our movement. And then when we get to the voting phase, they have been engaged with us for months. And by the time their ballot gets to their house, we've been having conversations for months about how they need to show up and get their friends and family to show up. So that's the opportunity. It's a huge endeavor. It's going to cost a lot of money, but we are positioned better than ever to do that work in our state. And that's what it's going to take.
Okay, so on that, I just want to underline, it's going to take a lot of money. This is work that people weren't thinking they were going to have to do, and it's like GOTV for 5 months, basically. It's going to run for all this time. We're going to be chasing down people's ballots. We're going to be having to have more conversations with people than previously, and there's no way to do that without these organizations being really well funded. Alex wants me to have everybody on the screen smile at one time so he can get a screenshot of all of us. Why don't we do that right now? Because we want to share that. So basically, I think I just have to ask you to smile. And Alex can do it. Is this?
Yep, smile one more time.
Okay, bigger smiles.
Everybody say Midwest.
Midwest. Yay.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, guys. I think I don't know, Billy, do we have time for one more question, or do you want to say something?
Can we end with a chant? Any like Doran, Art, Prentiss geniuses? Like, can we give like a standing ovation for your incredible, brilliant work that's going to save us all? Woohoo! Yeah. And it's you're doing your job organizing your states. And we have to do our job organizing everyone we know to support you in your work so that you have the resources you need to crush.